Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now this video marks a double celebration. First of all, it's a year today since I did my first ever video. The channel is 1 year old. Thank you so much for everyone who's jumped on board and subscribed and supported me through that year. And secondly, I've reached 650 subscribers. So once again, thank you for your support. It's incredible to reach that number. I can't believe it. Now, everyone who watches this channel knows that every major subscription number I reach, I do a silly nostalgia video. I missed out on 600. So this week I'm doing a double bill. And today what I'm going to talk about is my top 10 sitcom episodes. So I'm going to pick my top 10 sitcoms of all time and then my favourite episode of each sitcom. Now I should say from the very beginning, I'm a bit old-fashioned in my taste. So I'm going to be going back to the 70s, and the early 80s, sort of classic era. And it's all Brit as well. So I thought I'd say that right from the beginning. But let's jump in, my top 10 sitcom episodes of all time. Now at number 10, this shows how old-fashioned I am. Do you remember Steptoe and Son? This was arguably the first major sitcom in the UK. There had been sitcoms before that, but this was the sort of first one that was distinctive and homegrown and sort of gave a distinctly English and working class feel to the sitcom. And it was started in the 60s in black and white, and it went right through into the 70s, going into colour. And it starred Harry H. Corbett, you dirty old man, and Wilfrid Bramble, Harold. And they were two rag and bone men. Now, for those who are young people watching this video or people from abroad, I should explain what a rag and bone men are. There were these guys, I remember them, they were still around when I was a kid. And what they would do is they'd come along with a horse and cart, right? They'd have sort of shire ponies, and then they'd have this long, flat back cart. And what they did was they took all your rubbish, all the stuff that you couldn't get rid of, that was too big or too unwieldy to get rid of. They took your rubbish and they took it away and they used it or tried to sell it. They were sort of before recycling, There were loads of people that used to come round to the house. I mean, you had your milkman, there was the newspaperman, there was the rag and bone man, there was the pop van. Do you remember the pop van? It used to be Corona Pop, and it used to come round selling you bottles of pop. Flavours that you couldn't get in the shops, like Orangeade and Cherryade. Yeah, the pop van. There was the fish man used to come round and sell fresh fish off the back of his van. The coal van used to come round. Oh yes, the Avon lady. I remember all these things. But the rag and bone men, they were still coming around when I was a kid. And so Steptoe and Son is about this father and son, rag and bone men, living in this crappy house in the East End of London. And it was fun because it was usually just the two of them. And these actors, Harold H. Corbett had ideas that he might become the British Brando. He thought he'd become this major actor, but he became trapped in this sitcom for most of his life. And apparently he and the old man, Wilfrid Bramble, who's a wonderful old character actor, hated each other. They couldn't stand each other, but they were trapped in this sitcom together, this successful sitcom together for years. A sitcom which, bizarrely, because I think of it as being so British, but it was remade in the US as Sanford and Son. I've never seen an episode of it, but I can't imagine what it's like. I can't imagine there were rag and bone men in America, but probably there were. Anyway. Now, there's loads of good episodes of Steptoe and Son. One of my favourites is that episode where, in amongst their bric-a-brac, they find a What the Butler Saw machine. You remember those? They go back to the 1900s, and you sort of looked in the viewfinder. It's like an early kind of cinema. And you cranked the thing, and you got photos whizzed past, and you got the impression of seeing a film. And Harold is looking into this What the Butler Saw machine, and it's a sort of early porn film where this housewife is visited by a milkman who gets into the bath with her, and he's watching it going, oh, go on, yeah. And then he realises that the milkman is his own dad when he was young and he starred in a porn film. The look on his face is fantastic, and he goes, you disgusting old man. And then what happens is he's really embarrassed that his father was in this porn film. But then the local community finds out about it, and he the old man becomes celebrated as a star, much to Harold's disgust. That's a great episode. But I've got to pick the famous episode of Steptoe and Son, which is Divided We Stand, where they've decided that they hate each other so much that they actually divide their house down the middle. And they build a separate wall so they can't see each other, can't live with each other. But they've divided it so that, for example, the wall actually splits the TV in half with the controls on one side and the plug on the other. It's a fantastic episode. They install a turnstile near the kitchen so that they can't, to make sure that they're not in the kitchen at the same time as each other. It's brilliant. I love that episode to pieces. Now, number 9 is a modern sitcom, The Thick of It. I didn't watch this when it was first on, but I've been watching it since COVID. I've been watching it on YouTube, and I really, really like it. And I think the acting is brilliant. Peter Capaldi, Rebecca Front, superb. It's also, the Peter Capaldi character, Malcolm Tucker, is based on Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's press secretary. This kind of really bullying, tough Scots press secretary, who bullies the MPs and bullies the civil servants. And it's brilliantly written. It's so funny. It's got some of the best swearing in television. My favourite episode ever, I found out, is Series 3, Episode 7, Fact Fans. And it's the one where they bring in another spin doctor, played by David Haig from Thin Blue Line fame, who is also a Rudyard Kipling expert. Who knew? Anyway, and he comes in, he plays this character called Steve Fleming, and he's a really oily, shitty little bastard spin doctor, and he's a sort of rival to Peter Capaldi. And that episode is so brilliantly acted. The acting is amazing. It's almost so good, it almost stops you laughing, really. It's almost too true. But the lines of dialogue and the sort of tension between him and Capaldi is absolutely fantastic. I love that episode to pieces. At number 8, again, this shows how old-fashioned I am, Rising Damp. Remember Rising Damp from the early 70s? Rigsby, this horrible, mean-spirited miser who runs this boarding house. And he has 2 students upstairs and Francis de la Tour downstairs, who he's got a secret fancy for. You know what? It has dated badly. And when you go back to it, the material is terrible. But the 4 actors, Leonard Rossiter, still one of the best comedy actors Britain has ever produced. Frances de la Tour is wonderful as Mrs. Jones, although her and Leonard Rossiter hated each other because Leonard Rossiter was a true blue Tory and Frances de la Tour was a sort of feminist Labour leftist type, and they didn't speak to each other apparently on set. Anyway, and then upstairs is Richard Beckinsale and Don Warrington, and they all play their characters so perfectly. They're all so funny, and they're so good that even now they sort of transcend the material. It's just such joy to watch them acting together. There's lots of good episodes of Rising Damp, but my particular favourite, I have a love of ghost stories and everything ghostly, and I love the episode where Rigsby tries to convince the boys upstairs that there's a grey lady in the house. It's called Things That Go Bump in the Night, the episode. But Philip tells the Richard Beckinsale character to dress up as the grey lady, and they set about frightening Rigsby. Leonard Rossiter's acting goes into orbit, and it's very, very funny. Controversial, a very politically incorrect episode, but watch out for the Christmas episode where Rigsby believes Philip has brought him a Christmas present. I'm going to leave it there, but those of you who know Rising Damp will know the episode I mean. That is hilariously funny, but very politically incorrect. Now, talking of Leonard Rossiter, at number 7, The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. Not everyone's favourite comedy series. I love it. I loved it. My father introduced it to me when I was a kid. And one of the reasons I love it so much is because it reminds me of my dad. Because Leonard Rossiter in that series looked like my father. And it's about a guy having a midlife crisis. I always thought my dad was having a permanent midlife crisis. It's a very unusual series, Reggie Perrin, in that I think it's the only sitcom ever that is based on a novel. It's actually an adaptation. It wasn't written directly for the screen, it was based on a novel. That's quite unusual. And it actually has a story, it has a narrative, it develops. I think it was brilliantly cast. Everyone in it was so perfect, from Joan the secretary to, CJ the boss. I love it. The first 2 seasons are great. The last season is crap, I admit it. But the first 2 seasons are wonderful. My favourite episode, it's got to be the episode where he's got a crush on his secretary, Joan, who was, later in Coronation Street. Sue Nichols, I think her name was. She was also Mrs. Popov in Rent-A-Ghost. Anyway, he's developed a crush on her, so he invites her around one Sunday when his wife is at her mother's for an affair, but he can't go through with it. That episode, the acting between the two of them is just so hilarious. It's brilliantly done. And then eventually his wife's whole family come round to visit him while he's got this secretary upstairs. It's so good. So I also like when that episode is sort of rerun later on, when Reggie's become successful and he's become a millionaire, and he's got this company called Grot, and he rehires Joan as his secretary, and they have another attempt at having an affair, and another failure. I love those two episodes. Now, what was the best comedy series of the 70s? Reggie Perrin, I think, is a candidate. Another candidate is Porridge. Now, I used to love Porridge when I was a kid. Watching it now, I realise something, that this is one of the great television programmes to come out of the UK. It's so perfect. It's so perfectly cast. It's so perfectly played. I'd even go so far as to say it's better than just a good sitcom. It's a little piece. It's a work of popular art. If you wanted to understand Britain in the 70s, watch Porridge. This sitcom set in a prison, right, is a microcosm of Britain. And all the characters show how Britain works. It's beautifully done. It's better than just a sitcom. And in Fletcher, played by Ronnie Barker, I think Porridge found a comic character that's up there with Falstaff, you know, as a sort of avatar of Englishness, and the English working class man, and his sort of sarcastic, slight contempt for the system he's part of. I just think it's beautifully done, beautifully written, and Ronnie Barker is sublime in it. I can't think of a best episode here. The two Blanco episodes are great. You know, the one where he sells that treasure map to that guy, and in the final shot he's digging up for treasure in the middle of Leeds United Football Club. And also the wonderful one where Blanco is going to get parole, but he refuses it because he says he's not guilty of killing his wife. And I won't spoil it for those people who haven't seen it, but the last line is just perfect. One of the great last lines of any sitcom. My personal favourite episode, though, I've realised it's not a very popular episode amongst fans of the series. It's the second Christmas special. It's called The Desperate Hours. And it's where Fletcher and Godber, they get caught up in a hostage situation. And among the hostages is Barraclough, you know, and he's trapped with the governor's secretary. And it turns out that he and the governor's secretary have been having a little affair. He's worried about what his wife is going to think back home. He's more worried about that than being held at gunpoint. I really like that episode. I don't know why it's not so popular, but there you go. Number 5, back to a more modern title here, Father Ted. I love Father Ted. It's just the right side of silly and absurd, you know, about these three priests living together in Craggy Island off the coast of Ireland. Very, very funny. I love its sense of absurdity and its sense of surrealism. Picking a favourite episode, again, there's so many. I love the sheep episode when they're trying to cheer the sheep up. And the piss take of Speed is fantastic. But I've picked Are You Right There, Father Ted, which is the racist episode, which I think is just so funny. When Father Ted realises that there's a Chinatown on Craggy Island, and he inadvertently upsets the Chinese community, and then upsets them again by ranting and raving in front of a very precisely square black piece, you know, black square on his window. I love that episode. And when he goes outside, you know, to try and calm the Chinese people down, and that bloke's then he goes, "I hear you're a racist now, Father." That whole scene is just brilliant. Just absolutely superb. 4th place, okay, I love Alan Partridge. Alan Partridge is the best thing to happen to British comedy since 1990. Well, unless you count Chris Morris and Day to Day and Brass Eye, which is just genius, but I haven't included that as sitcom. But the next best thing, okay, is Alan Partridge. And Partridge is Coogan's one great creation. Let's be honest, he never bettered it, did he? But it's a brilliant creation, this sort of crappy little local DJ who's desperate to become a big name in television and is constantly getting it wrong because of his small-mindedness. Coogan plays it to absolute perfection. I love all of Alan Partridge, but I particularly like the first 3 seasons of it, really. Knowing Me, Knowing You, the sort of fake chat show. And then the sitcom that it sort of breeds and leads into, I'm Alan Partridge. I couldn't find a favourite episode to pick from those 2 seasons of I'm Alan Partridge because they're all so perfect. But I'm going to pick To Kill a Mocking Alan, the Mentalist episode. You're a mentalist. I love this episode so much. It's the one where these two Irish producers want him to make a documentary about Ireland. And there's more to Ireland than this. That one. And then it's later on, he gives this crappy little conference in the Travel Tavern to all these bored looking pensioners. And then Jed, his super fan, turns up. I just want to be your friend, Alan, and takes them off to his house. That whole sequence at the end with the mentalist is fantastic. It's brilliant horror comedy. And that's my favourite episode of Alan Partridge. But they're all absolutely brilliant. Coogan was on fire doing this, and he's never bettered it. 3, I've got to pick Blackadder because this was my favourite series when I was a teenager, and it still makes me laugh now. The first season is a bit crap, as everyone says, but the next 3 seasons are all terrific. So I don't really know which episode to pick, but I'm going to pick... I really like the First World War series. That's become my favourite series, Blackadder Goes Forth. That's so well written and performed. Each of the actors is so perfect in the roles they're given. And I'm going to pick the second episode, Corporal Punishment, with the Flanders pigeon murderer, you know, and where Blackadder is put on trial for killing General Melchit's favourite pigeon, his favourite carrier pigeon. That's a great episode, beautifully performed, very funny. Okay, now we get to the top 2. Now, the second choice I've picked for this thing is not one of my favourite series. I do like it very much, but I wouldn't say I'm as fond of it as some of the series I've mentioned. But this particular episode, I think, is the episode of television that most made me laugh when I first saw it. It's the first episode of the second season of The Young Ones, Bambi, the University Challenge episode. Oh my God. From the very moment it starts to the end, it is absolutely hilarious. From them, you know, taking their laundry to the laundrette, and the washing machine won't open up until they tell them they've got Felicity Kendall's underwear in there. You know, all the way through to, you know, Vivian sticking his head out of the train, which I thought was the funniest thing I'd ever seen as a 12-year-old, to the brilliant, you know, University Challenge sequence at the end with young Emma Thompson. Young Ben Elton was in there. Griff Rhys-Jones playing Bamber Gascoigne. Fantastic. You know, Hugh Laurie's in it. I think that is just a sort of perfect 30 minutes of television. And if that's not good enough, Lemmy and Motorhead turn up to sing Ace of Spades in the middle of it. Watch out for Vivian eating a donut and then just going to the person, the person behind the counter. That bit always makes me laugh. So that I'm picking this episode not because The Young Ones is my favourite series, although I do love The Young Ones. Basically, if you've never seen The Young Ones, it's about 4 guys in a flat share. They're students, and one of them is a punk, one of them is a hippie, one of them is a cool guy who's good with the girls, and the other one, and the best, played by Rick Mail, and I think this was a stroke of genius. He's kind of woke before woke was invented. He's a sort of trendy, left, right-on kid, you know, who's a real wanker. And the performance by Rick Mail is just so funny, just absolute genius. But yeah, I had to pick that because I think of any episode of television, that's the one that's made me laugh the most when I first saw it. But number 1, you know what it's going to be. It's got to be Fawlty Towers. You know, I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he said Fawlty Towers isn't as funny as it used to be. I've got to disagree. I still think it's absolutely brilliant. The way that John Cleese and Connie Booth mount the farce of each episode and run all the different strains together, it's so brilliantly done. Best episode? Well, there's so many. There's the Germans. There's the psychiatrist episode, you know, the one where John Cleese, you know, puts his hand around the door and puts his hand on her boob. You remember that one? There's the rat. But my personal favourite, I've got to pick the Kipper and the Corpse, the dead body. I just think that is sublime. Every joke lands brilliantly, from the old woman in the cupboard to Geoffrey Palmer downstairs wanting his sausages. It's just great. And the mounting up of the farce is brilliant, and Cleese's hysteria gets better and better and better. I absolutely love that episode. You know, the rat, the Germans, the psychiatrist episode, they're all great. They're all brilliant. They're all classics. But the Kipper and the Corpse, that's my number 1 sitcom episode of all time. The writing, the acting, the pacing is just perfect. But am I wrong? What are your favourite sitcoms? Which ones have I missed out? I know I've missed out loads of American sitcoms like Seinfeld and The Simpsons and all that. So please let me know what your favourite episodes are. If you agree with if the sitcoms I've chosen, but different episodes that you like, please let me know. And as always, if you like my content, please like and subscribe.